Good day. My name is Doug Besheroff, and I teach at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. We are delighted to host this webinar with the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, and I thank APPAM's superlative team for making this event possible. Um, APPAM has hosted a series of webinars on changes in the federal government on topics such as the future of public service aimed at students, the future for data access, and cuts in federal employment and programs, a topic we'll talk about here a little bit. APPAM hosts a monthly virtual meetup as well called Candid Conversations for members of the public policy community. All events are open to the public. Please check appam.org for a list of future virtual and in-person events. Today's topic is policy research and program evaluation after DOGE. Since President Trump returned to office, major cuts have been made in staff and funding across almost all federal research and evaluation programs, including health, education, social services, environment, and international aid programs. The cuts have been accompanied by major changes in infrastructure and governance. Outsiders have not discerned a clear theme to the cuts. They may simply be opportunistic, but they sure are substantial and widespread. This has been and continues to be a deeply troubling process, not just for the staff involved, but because past decades have seen strengthened evaluation methods advance our understanding of many social problems and how to better address them. A public and private infrastructure and disciplinary practices that took more than a generation to build are seemingly being dismantled, forcing attendant cutbacks in university and private firm programs. And no one on the outside seems to know whether there is more to come. Nevertheless, past federal approaches to policy research and program evaluation were not without weaknesses. And many of us would have liked to see various and in some cases fundamental changes made, mainly to make the field more policy relevant. The elevator sentence is faster, less expensive studies that answer important questions accurately and with practical solutions. That's a lot to aim for, but at least until now, progress has been very slow. Ironically, the current cuts may present an opportunity for the adoption of long advocated reforms. There will come a time, one hopes sooner rather than later, when federal research and evaluation efforts will need to be reconstituted in one form or another. Although planners will not be working from a completely clean slate, that will be an opportunity to improve on past approaches, perhaps in important ways. Thus, even though the dust is not yet settled, this is an opportune time to begin considering the shape of a revised and one hopes improved federal research and evaluation strategy. With that in mind, we have recruited a panel of nationally known and respected leaders to address four interrelated and cross-cutting questions. Cecilia Rouse, our first speaker, is president of the Brookings Institution, a former chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and a former dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. She will address the question, what opportunities are likely to open in policy research? Sherry Glide is the dean of the NYU Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, a former assistant secretary for planning and evaluation at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and a former president of APPAM. She will address the question, Can we build on past successes to make evaluations more policy and program relevant? Paul Decker is the president of Mathematica and also a former president of APPAM. He will address the question, how will AI and IT generally affect evaluation processes? Last, David Reingold is Chancellor, Indiana University at Bloomington, a former Purdue Senior Vice President for Policy Planning and Dean of its College of Liberal Arts, and a former Director of the Office of Research and Policy Development for the U.S. Corporation for National and Community Service. He will address the question, what should students and prospective students be told? Something on all our minds these days. Each panelist will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes. After they all speak, I will ask them collectively if they'd like to add something to each other's discussions. After that, I will read questions from the chat from the audience. So feel free to ask questions in the icon question and answer, either while we're doing this or later. And we'll proceed. CC Rouse will open, and for her presentation, the rest of us will turn off our cameras. CC, the floor is yours.
Terrific. And good afternoon, everyone. I think at this moment, there are so many opportunities for us all in terms of understanding the impact of the current actions, which I think can be viewed as estimating the value of components of the federal government and its expenditures, as well as thinking about new policy ideas, given that the landscape has been almost completely changed. So let me just elaborate on both. First, for those who study government capacity and the effectiveness of existing federal departments and programs, including the federal workforce, which is fundamentally what the federal government is and how it gets its work done, the current impacts may provide, what we might call natural experiments for research. For example, USAID as an agency had been controversial for quite some time. So this included questions about the effectiveness of its funding. Many had been concerned it fostered dependency and didn't really help to developing countries really grow and foster economic development and economic growth. So its sudden demise and the abrupt decrease in U.S. international aid provide a somewhat exogenous change in the impact of such foreign assistance that can be studied. And importantly, if you ask me, I think we will be back in the international aid game. It provides an opportunity to think through and to imagine more effective ways on which to deliver such assistance. Currently, many Americans question the value of federal expenditures in a number of domains. Again, the decrease in services provided by agencies such as FEMA, the IRS, and others provide a way to better understand how Americans understand and value them. After all, if we're going to have a healthy democracy where Americans are voting for a government, the kind of government they want, then they have to also understand how much they value or don't value the kind of services that they receive. And if we can develop a clear understanding of which services Americans truly value and why, and which ones they may potentially miss, it may provide an opportunity to better design them in the future, or at least better brand them so that Americans can understand exactly what the federal government does, again, which I believe is important for a healthy democracy. There are also many who believe that the restructuring and how we fund and support basic research and development may be one of the biggest losses stemming from our current actions. This goes to the funding the support in universities in particular, and think tanks. I don't want to take my own field out of the game here. So top among concerns is that it will slow innovation, which, as we know, is a foundation for economic growth and has made a huge difference in terms of well-being, both here and abroad. So research that better articulates research and development pipeline and proposes enough ways to rebuild it will be in high demand, and I can tell you that from many perspectives. Finally, this moment is also rare. It's also quite exciting, because for any researcher interested in shaping future policy, because what it presents right now, potentially the first time in decades, there is truly a thirst, as well as an opportunity for fresh thinking and potentially transformative change. So as Doug alluded to, and as we all know, since January 20th, DOGE and the Trump administration have upended the status quo on so many dimensions. And so as these systems are being re-examined or dismantled, it provides an opportunity to think about what may come next. These are opportunities for reimagining how our institutions and systems can better serve the American people and the communities around the world. So questions such as might include, for example, many of our multilateral organizations were designed for the global north. But what might a future multilateral system with more emphasis or even centered on the global south look like? And that's particularly important with the rise of China. Another question, achievement in U.S. K-12 educational institutions has been falling behind our peers for some time. Given the Trump administration, if you look at Project 2025, which contemplates and proposes dismantling the federal U.S. Department of Education and delivering many of the services and expenditures in a different way, we could ask, is there a more effective role for the federal government in terms of a system that truly supports the learning of all children? I think this is particularly important in light of the learning losses that we know have emerged since the pandemic. Secondly, third, we know in post-secondary education, as tuition has been rising, more of the burden has been falling on families and students. As a result, more students are taking out student loans in order to help pay for those tuition increases. How can we redesign a post-secondary educational financial system to allow for better access, but without overburdening borrowers if we think of student loans, and overtaxing taxpayers if we think of providing more grant aid, or even the Biden administration's very aggressive and very generous income-based repayment program, which was going to cost taxpayers quite a bit of money. But is there a way that we can design a system which both preserves access but doesn't overburden everybody? Another question is, our federal fiscal situation is due for a reckoning. So this is for the economists out there. We have historically high levels of debt and changing demographics. And if we don't, there's going to be a reckoning where Congress is going to be interested in new ideas for both bringing in revenue and for us, in a very smart, strategic way, addressing spending. And yet we know this is true for many aspects of our government. Systems were designed for a different economy for a different time. For example, our tax code is 100 years old, and it was designed for a time when labor income was a much more important component of wealth than it is today. Furthermore, our entitlements, especially Social Security, were designed at a time that we had increasing population growth, and yet we know that our dependency ratio will be growing over the next many years with the aging of our population. So this is going to be a moment where there's going to be a lot of thirst for research and reform ideas on both the tax side and the spending side that I think will provide an opportunity for researchers that we haven't seen in a while. In addition, we have climate change. This administration is attempting to downplay its importance, but we know that the consequences are going to become more expensive and impactful. And, with the dismantling of many government and with many departments within the government, there will be a time when we're going to be very interested in serious and innovative ways to address climate change. And we're going to need to have new ideas on the table ready to go when we do so. And finally, at the time that Congress, and Paul will speak to this, I presume, where Congress and the administration are following a path of not providing guardrails when it comes to artificial intelligence, yet we know that it's coming, and even those in the industry understand there need to be rules of the road. How might government impose those guardrails that both protect us from the potential harm, but without stifling innovation? And also, how do we leverage the advancements in AI to support rather than hurt the American worker? So there are many questions that this moment provides. This is such an important time for researchers, especially those who are interested in developing new and innovative policies. It's a time where many of our policies were designed for a different economy, for a different society. And so what are the ways that we can make those kinds of innovations so that when the moment comes, we have ideas ready to go for policymakers who see the need to take them up. So just as my concluding thought, it was actually Doug Basharov who reminded us at one of the early meetings of this group that Milton Friedman, of all people, who wrote In Capitalism and Freedom back in the 1980s, a thought that, from my perspective at least, really speaks to this moment and the role of research. And here's what Milton Friedman had to say, quote, "There is enormous inertia, a tyranny of the status quo in private and especially government arrangements. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." And with that, I cede the floor.
Thank you very much, Cece. That was great. And of course, especially these days, a very necessary piece of nonpartisanship or bipartisanship, whatever it is. Our next panelist is Sherry Glide, and I'm just going to get out of the way. Sherry?
Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you, Cece. I'm going to just give you a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about and then get into it. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of the evaluation infrastructure we have now, its contributions and limitations, and possible directions for the future. I want to start by talking about data and methods, but then, next slide, please. I want to talk about lunch with the secretary. So let me turn off my slides and just talk to you all and start off with a little bit of history. So, the federal evaluation infrastructure that we think of today, which is largely within the departments of the federal government, really dates back to the 1960s, to the war on poverty, to a time of an expansive and ambitious government that aimed to do a lot and wanted to do it well. And it started off with evaluation offices, first in the old Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which turned into ASPE at HHS, which a position I was privileged to hold. And then later there were offices in other federal departments, policy development and research at housing, planning, evaluation, and policy development at ed, and so on. So many operating departments with policy evaluation offices within them. And all of these offices had wherever we are right now, a somewhat similar structure. I want to kind of highlight some of the elements of that structure as we think about moving forward. I think we'll be wanting to think a lot about the governance of the evaluation effort. So in all of these offices, they were typically led by assistant secretaries, typically Senate confirmed, which is an interesting design, both with advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage, of course, is that it takes forever and ever to be Senate confirmed, but the advantage is that it guarantees you a seat at certain tables that I think it's really important for evaluation to be sitting at. Those offices were then staffed up by master's level, often PhD level analysts who became subject matter experts. I am always reminded, whenever I think about this, I think of Gordon Fisher, who was at ASPE for many years and knew more about the poverty guidelines and their origins than any 12 other people I can imagine. The evaluation divisions within the departments worked really closely with the operating divisions. So I early in my career, I spent some time at the Council of Economic Advisors, and there you're working more with OMB, you're working at the leadership level. But when the evaluation offices within the departments had to work with the people who are actually implementing policy. And again, I'll come back to that in a minute because I think it is a critical defining aspect of it. They contributed to the budget processes within the departments. So department budgets tend to be focused around the budget offices who are looking at the process evaluation. Effectively, did this operating division do the things it was supposed to do? But an evaluation office sitting at the table could add, and were those processes actually generating the outcomes that this program was supposed to achieve? Didn't always work that way, but that is sort of in the water of what they're supposed to be trying to do. And then they typically conduct internal research projects on a relatively small scale using available data. And their contracting officers, CODARs, I didn't know what that was until I got there, for federally funded evaluations, usually conducted by outside contractors in research shops and in academic institutions. So this big framework of evaluation, which has had some tremendous successes, and I actually look back at the literature on what have evaluation offices done, and just to give you 3 super clear wins, and maybe to get an idea in your heads of what these things might be about. Some of the large-scale research projects funded through the evaluations offices that have had a continuing effect over more than 50 years on program design. The negative income tax experiments of the 1970s and 1980s, which were funded out of ASPE, the Rand Health Insurance experiment, which was funded out of ASPE in the late 1970s and early 1980s, moving to Opportunity at HUD, funded in the, run in the mid 1990s. These programs not only mattered in their time, but even now we are using the estimates that those programs came up with as the basis of modeling of new policy opportunities. So the potential for investing in sort of fundamental research, I think actually in the evaluation space is really there. Also, considerable investment, and here I'm going to speak mostly about ASPE because that's what I know best, in models that were subsequently used for designing programs. So the big investment in the TRIM models, the Urban Institute's TRIM models that actually helped generations of welfare policy design, Rand and Urban built health insurance simulation models in the Clinton and Obama era. There was a lot of modeling that we did for the Class Act back in 2010. So again, efforts to do prospective policy analysis using the results of past evaluations to inform how you might make decisions into the future. And then later, I think moving into more micro kinds of things, program-specific evaluations like teen pregnancy prevention and home visiting, and the efforts of the social and behavioral sciences team in the Obama administration across many departments to improve the way that programs were rolled out. So again, a different kind of a different level of analysis, more micro, more focused on individual programs. And then within internal projects and contracted projects that tried to solve specific operational issues in an evaluation framework, how best to target FDA inspections? How do you decide which farms do you inspect when? How do you evaluate Medicare bundled payment demonstrations? We did injectable drug shortages, how best to add specific sensitive questions to the medical expenditure panel survey. This is just a small smattering of the kinds of questions that the evaluation effort actually did. But at the same time, there's a lot. I remember walking in my first time in HHS and seeing all those bound volumes on the walls. Now they're of course all just in a hard drive somewhere. And not everything that we funded or that the evaluation offices did worked really well. Often the time scale of analysis and the and evaluation doesn't line up with the political time scale. So I think it is notable that those big research projects like the negative income tax experiment and the health insurance experiment, that the good thing about them is because they came up with such fundamental findings, even though the political juice for the particular proposal they were looking at had run out by the time the project was done, they were sort of evergreen for later research projects. That's not always the case, and often the analysis just cannot be done on the timescale that's necessary. Second, there is an interest, and I think there are a lot of congressionally mandated evaluations that have this form for kind of up or down, does this program work or does it not work kinds of analysis. Typically, what I found tended to be the case is that those were usually a muddle. Nobody ever came out and said that this doesn't work or this really does work. They were typically underpowered. There's a lot of underpowered analysis that gets done, or kind of mushy qualitative analysis. Not all qualitative analysis by any means is mushy, but some of these things, because it was really hard to think about how to do the evaluation of something, turned into a long report without a lot of substance that you could use going forward. Maybe useful in a congressional hearing, maybe useful as a way of grilling program staff about things, but not necessarily a way to move forward. And then finally, many topics that we should have been studying never did get studied, particularly projects that are around the implementation and management of programs in real time. So how do we think about doing whatever we're doing better? So with all that history in the background, what opportunities do we have to move forward? I think the most obvious one is around data. And of course, the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, all of the data work that's been done since then is about trying to use administrative data more effectively for policy analysis. And the technology for doing that improves day after day. So the potential for using AI in existing data, including sources that are hard to read or are not consistent over time, really opens up the opportunity for using administrative data to do things. And then improved technology for combining data across multiple sources, potentially, and this was a big focus of the Commission, including linkages to individual and corporate tax data, which would allow, and I think importantly, evaluations of programs without using surveys or new data collection to figure out whether things had happened or not. So really a potential for using data to answer questions more quickly and more cheaply. And much bigger data, which would do a lot to mitigate the underpowered problem. I also think a really important consideration in using these big data and making it more useful is that it would allow us to do a lot more distributional analysis and lean into the heterogeneity across sites, across design decisions, across populations that has typically not been a feature of most federal evaluations. Giving policymakers a better handle on who the winners and losers are, I think would make them more receptive to the whole evaluation project. In preparing for this, I was looking at some of the MTO data. The lease-up factors among sites varied by a factor of more than 2. Many outcomes varied in sign between the sites. So we have an average effect, but maybe there's actually a lot to be learned in the heterogeneity. And with a lot more data, we could investigate that further. But big data also raises big challenges and really serious concerns about data privacy. I think whatever you may feel about the current administration's use of data, privacy experts are certainly going to be even more alarmed than they have in the past about the potential of linking federal data in the current environment. And then there are just more practical concerns around data ownership and stewardship and accountability. Who's going to make the data available? Who will provide the documentation? Who will explain the context where the data were collected, what they mean? Why would those people even do it, especially if this project is split across agencies or across departments? So again, I think we actually come back to governance there. Let me talk briefly about methods. We also have much better methods over time for using these kinds of data. The causality revolution in economics really gives us more opportunities to convincingly address concerns about internal validity and can be very well coupled with existing data sets and potentially with large language models to identify discontinuities in natural experiments. I think one of my favorites that we ought to be doing a lot more of is looking at the scoring of projects and the outcomes of highly scored and poorly scored projects that do get funded to see whether even our scoring systems are working well. So lots of potential for projects that could inform the management of programs. So all of this is great. I think there's lots and lots of things that we could do. We can build up an evaluation infrastructure that makes better use of data and uses new methods. But now I come to, I think that the crux of the matter, which is my lunch with the secretary question. Everything I've talked about until now is really about the supply side of the evaluation infrastructure, but the demand side is at least as important, and it is often neglected, and not only by one side of administration or another. Over the last 14 years, the position of ASPE at HHS has been filled for 5 years. The position of ASP at Labor has been filled for 5 years. The position of Assistant Secretary for Evaluation at HUD has been filled for 7 years. And this speaks to the fact that you can actually run the government without the evaluation offices there, even though they will not run as well. Most people who are in leadership in government have a pretty weak understanding of why you would want to have an evaluation office or an analysis office. I actually think we should move away from the term evaluation and maybe think about evidence offices. And this came home to me very sharply, so I just want to give you a quick anecdote to finish with. When I first got to ASPE, it had taken me over a year to get confirmed. And Secretary Sebelius, who was a wonderful secretary, had been a governor, had been an insurance commissioner, knew a lot about the executive branches of government. She'd come in after Tom Daschle had not gotten the job. She didn't know any of the assistant secretaries. So I finally get there and she invites me for lunch. And I come to her office and I sit down very nervously with my boss to talk about what we're going to do. And she looks me straight in the face and she says, okay, so it's been a year and a half to get you here, but now what does ASPE do? I was a little floored for a moment because ASPE didn't really do anything. Evaluation offices don't do anything. And finally I looked at her and said, well, ASPE doesn't do anything. ASPE thinks. That's what we're here for. We're here to think for you. She thought about it for a second. And she said, you mean like you're kind of the internal think tank for HHS? And I said, yes, why don't you think of it that way? And I have to say that I spent a great deal of my time in the first year, especially that I was there, in making the case for being the think tank, for being useful to the secretary and to the operating divisions, not only trustworthy, but actually providing them compelling evidence that would help them do their jobs. That is a critical part of the evaluation or evidence building infrastructure. Without that, you can do wonderful analysis. You can have wonderful data. We can all publish lots of papers, but no one's going to pay any attention to it. So as we think about rebuilding this infrastructure, we need to be thinking about building the compelling case for the people who are going to use our evidence, that it's not being used to judge them, and that's why I don't like the word evaluation. It's not being used to give them an A grade or something. It's actually potentially valuable to them in doing the things that they want to do better. So let me stop there and turn it over to others. Thank you.
Sherry, thank you so much. That was great. Paul Decker, I heard a little bit about big data and AI, so looks like we've got a very good handoff here.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll build on some of what Sherry was talking about in terms of bringing new technology to the evaluation or the analysis world. And as the president of the organization that administered the negative income tax experiment, I can agree about the need to continue to sell the value of evaluations to policymakers. So Doug, if you can go to the next slide, I'll just state what the thesis of my talk is basically, and that is evaluations are an investment. And that investment over time, historically, has been highly constrained by the cost, the scale, the time that's been needed to conduct old style evaluations. And AI is going to change that calculation permanently, and I'll lay some of that out. So when we think about the history, and Sherry touched on it over the last 60 years of evaluation, the founding and the development of modern evaluation occurred when data were scarce and technology was very limited. And so we had to work with that environment. And I and other members of the panel here today were products of that environment. Back then, for this investment that needed to take place, the evaluation was often slow and expensive. A lot of that came from the need to collect primary data in most cases. Generally, data didn't exist to address those research questions, so that was often the first step of a large-scale study. And that takes a lot of time and money to carry out. For each one of the evaluations that have the long-lasting impact that Sherry described, that was the case. Another factor is once those data were created, they were static. They were also relatively simple. It largely just a grid of numbers that was then frozen in time. So the degree to which we could draw information from that grid of numbers was limited. So evaluations tended to be somewhat limited in scope during that time. All of this has been changing over the last 20 years, and just the way that Sherry described. And we've seen the introduction of data science methods in response to an explosion of accessible data, pre-existing data sources from the results of transactions, and also the explosion in new technologies in order to be able to leverage those data, including technologies that allow us to leverage unstructured data, something that wasn't considered possible when I began in the field. In addition, those data not only are that we can use are not only readily available, they're being constantly updated in real time. So it's a much more dynamic picture when we talk about data analysis these days. And that's critical because back in the old days when we had expensive evaluations, they were largely constrained to big policy questions where Congress was largely the audience. We were weighing in on big decisions that Congress had to make. Now with data everywhere, the process is much cheaper, much faster. We can address needs of program administrators and program implementers, folks that have questions every day, and the data now can be used as in an updated way to weigh in on those questions very actively. And then more recently, we've had the breakthrough of generative AI based on large language models. And that's just now transforming research in the ways that I'll describe in a minute. But a common thread and theme across history is that as the data become more democratized and the technology advances, evaluation capabilities can also advance so that we can produce cheaper, better, and faster conclusions from that work. So now let me just address a couple of disruptions in the next slide that are very current. One is the impact of DOGE and the new administration. And Doug talked about the cuts that we know about. And in the short run, that's been fairly devastating to evaluation efforts with contract cancellations. Although some of those are coming back, that's a long-term issue and something that could use a deeper discussion. But I also want to look behind those cuts about some of the mentality that may become more permanent over time, even after the cuts are completed. So we're beginning to see new expectations around the application and deployment of technology and greater urgency around using technology to generate evaluations that are cheaper, better, and faster. In some ways, you can think of the changes that are happening in the federal government now as a response to pent-up demand for modernization in the public sector. The public sector is often seen as being behind the private sector in terms of adapting technology to generate greater efficiency. As technology becomes modernized in the federal sector, we can expect we can expect an acceleration of that pre-existing trend of leveraging technology to enhance public policy evaluation, as I described, because it creates pressure to leverage technology more quickly, to reduce time and money needed to support evaluations. And the truth is, all along, there's been widespread frustration with the expense and time needed for traditional large-scale evaluations. So this is critical to the future of evaluations. The second disruption I want to highlight is the emergence of agentic AI, another step up in the technology. Right now, there's already potential for AI to help make evaluations cheaper, better, faster, and more powerful. And agentic AI is going to raise the bar so we can provide an even more powerful response in striving for better, cheaper, faster evaluations in the future. With AI agents acting more independently and more decisions being delegated by the human user to the AI agents. So what does that look like when we switch from the now to the future? What do I see as the main roadmap? Well, I see that as coming in three general steps. Right now, we exist in an environment where I think of AI's value added as evaluation assistance. There's currently really no generic or comprehensive AI solution for evaluation. Instead, what we have is a hybrid of AI being used as a tool in a process that's still largely controlled by humans. And AI tends to be applied in a piecemeal way to different pieces of the evaluation enterprise. And how it helps those different evaluations, different pieces of the evaluation, depends on the specifics of the evaluation. As I said, overall, this is still a largely human-driven process using AI as a tool. Regardless, it should generate less demand on labor, lower costs, and generate faster results compared with an approach that avoids AI. And to think about examples of how AI can be deployed now on evaluations, those include drafting documents, conducting literature reviews, data identification and extraction, including with unstructured data, data quality and cleaning, including being able to expedite the coding that conducts the cleaning using agents for fast decisions in those coding decisions, and identifying data patterns, including helping identify causality from the data patterns. Over time, we'll move to the next level, which I think of as AI-driven workflows. And I think of that as being in the near future, the next 2 or 3 years. Even under this model, conducting evaluations will require humans to have substantial control over the evaluation process and assure quality over the process. But there will be a larger delegation of a larger subset of decisions to AI to support the evaluation. So that will significantly shorten the life cycle of policy evaluations. How much of that workflow can be shifted to AI Well, that's going to depend on the ability of AI to think. And I put think in quotes, and this is something that's a very hot debate right now, including on LinkedIn just today. But it's combining AI's ability to think over time with its ability to leverage a robust knowledge base, which already exists. For example, as this capability develops, we can imagine AI agents playing a much more independent role on data cleaning, that there'd be less back and forth between the human and the AI user. The human will provide just general guidance, and then AI will make the decisions based on what they read, what AI reads in the data, the AI agent reads in the data. Also, AI agent may be able to automate the research plan, deciding what the data pipeline should be used in the evaluation to complete the project, incorporate that pipeline into the technical specifications for the project, and perhaps update the plans as new data streams in. And then AI may play a larger role in helping human users identify causal relationships and distinguish between those relationships and other statistical associations. Then finally, thinking further out, and there's a big question mark around this, there's the possibility of AI automated evaluations. In this case, the evaluations would entail minimal coding and minimal human-based reviews. That would generate significant savings in terms of labor and time. And the results would be even more real time with that automation. So in this case, changes to plans, data, specifications could all be carried out directly by AI agents. Now, again, this requires an even more generalized AI capability that can reflect and self-correct. Obviously, that's a riskier situation unless the human review and intervention that's organized around that effort is adequately designed. So we risk biased results if the human review and the intervention and oversight of the AI tool is not adequately designed. For the foreseeable future, even in this stage, humans are still necessary to manage the risk of this kind of work, interpret and contextualize findings, and make recommendations based on the results. So here we see three themes that really play across time. As AI technology advances, there's an increasing opportunity for better, cheaper, faster evaluations. Furthermore, humans will continue to play a key role, as I've described, but that role will change. I don't know exactly, we can't know exactly what the role of humans will be in 5 years in the process, but it's hard to imagine humans won't still have a critical role in the process. Regardless, in general, the way I think we can think about this is the human role will begin to rise above the tactical aspects of a project, past tactical decisions around coding or collecting data, and become more and delegate more of those decisions to AI and concentrate more on the strategic decisions that are made based on the results that come out of the AI efforts. So we can think of humans more as a strategic guides for the evaluations. And then finally, based on this capability, it's going to be important for the evaluation community to embrace these methods and to modernize alongside the technology. So to effectively guide public policy, we're all going to have to, in order to be evidence-informed and data-driven in the way in which we support decisions, we're all going to need to stay on top of these innovations, upskill ourselves, and embrace a mindset of utilizing AI to drive our work. So I'll leave you with 3 concrete steps for individuals and others. For practitioners, for those of you who aren't using AI already, my suggestion would be to start by integrating AI tools into small tasks in the research that you do, literature reviews, coding, or report writing. For institutions, we need to update evaluation standards to account for AI-assisted methods. And that won't be a one-off. As methods continue to evolve, we're going to have to continue to update those standards over time. For funders and policymakers, as has already been mentioned, those folks have to think about how to invest in a shared AI infrastructure and governance to reduce duplication and encourage faster, more consistent adoption of AI in the process. So I'll leave you here with this slide, an extension of my thesis. That is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, evaluation began in a world of scarcity, and AI is ushering in a world of abundance. And we need to be ready to shape that world.
Paul, thank
Back to
you.
you, Doug.
Paul, thank you so much. Wow, we're getting loads of comments. You'll have a chance to explore them for all the speakers. But now we have David Reingold. David, you're on.
All right. Thank you, Doug, and thank you everybody who's on this webinar. Big shout out to APPAM for hosting us. And I've got a couple of items here that I wanted to discuss and talk about, specifically what we know about the current condition of program evaluation and policy analysis labor market. What is the likely impact on the field over time if some of the current disruptions continue? And how should we advise current policy analysis and program evaluation students? And how should public policy affairs administration schools and programs and others that are involved in preparing students for careers in these spaces react? So if we go ahead and take that slide down, but that's what I want to talk about. All right, terrific. So what do we know about the current policy analysis and program evaluation labor market and how it's impacting current students? And right now, I think all we're dealing with is mostly anecdotal information. We don't know exactly how recent events have changed the labor market. We've got a lot of anecdotal reports which suggest that there have been substantial negative impacts, declines, and in job opportunities and internships for students that want to pursue careers in these spaces, particularly those who are interested in working in Washington, D.C. and in federal service. Lots of reports about graduating students and current students who wanted to pursue careers in these areas, finding that there are few or limited jobs. Many current students finding that their hopes for a summer internship or an internship that they had lined up all of a sudden were canceled or no longer available. Many students with policy analysis skills may find careers in other fields and other parts of the labor market outside of the government and outside of some of the highly coveted positions in places like Mathematica and some of the other well-known DC, Boston, and New York City firms. And perhaps some of them will be able to reemerge and find careers in these spaces. I will sort of point out that here at Indiana University, we have the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, which is one of the more well-regarded schools of public affairs in the United States and one of the larger ones. And you can see some of the shifts that are happening in some of the internships. Now, interestingly, among O'Neill School students last summer, there are actually more internships available to students this summer than they were last summer, but they have shifted quite dramatically. So, for example, 10% of all O'Neill students had internships in summer 2024 in Washington, D.C. in the federal government. That is now, for this summer, down to 2%. You see federal internships last summer and summer 2024 outside of Washington, D.C. at 15%, and in this summer in 2025, it's down to 3%. That shift is actually corresponding with an uptick in opportunities in local government, where almost half of all internships this year, compared to about a third last year, are in local government settings, and about 1 in 5 internships in summer of 2024 were in state government, and now that's up to about a third. So you are sort of seeing these students find opportunities, but not in federal service and not in Washington, D.C. So I guess one question that has been on my mind is sort of depending on how long some of these disruptions last, with some of these contract cancellations and shifts in support for federal policy analysis and program evaluation. Many of we heard a great discussion on sort of what the future might look like in terms of the overall infrastructure and its focus and the kind of work that is likely to take place. But I guess one question that I have is, is anybody going to be left to actually do this work, and what are the consequences in terms of the kinds of expertise that people are going to need in order to succeed in this area? So it's almost always the who before the what in trying to stand up any kind of enterprise, and I think that's absolutely the case when one is working on program evaluation and policy analysis topics. So, so how can students hedge some of their bets without walking away from these areas? It's obviously, I think, a field that all the panelists and myself sort of dedicated much of our careers to. We think that there's valuable work in doing it. It adds to our general understanding of and knowledge base about the public's work and how to increase effectiveness in government. You heard about its connection to overall innovation in economic environments. So how should students react? Another way to answer this question is to consider where are program evaluations skills useful in other parts of the labor market, or what more focused areas of broad program evaluation space are likely to remain open to newcomers in the labor market. We like to say that program evaluation skills or policy analysis skills are useful in many domains, and that I think will be the case moving forward. Statistical modeling has become ubiquitous in many parts of the labor market. And so those skills are transferable, and I certainly would encourage students to really lean into that kind of training and coursework. Given some of the enormous challenges related to our current federal deficit and debt, the historic connection between program evaluation and budget planning is likely, I think, to be a place where opportunity will exist. And that's sort of, I think, when Sherry was talking about sort of some of these early years of how the sort of the world of program evaluation sort of emerged. It emerged, I think, with a sense that it would be connected with and intricately tied to the budgeting process of public organizations, particularly the federal government. And it corresponded with the emergence, for those who recall, of the standing up or the evolution of the Bureau of the Budget to the Office of Management and Budget in the late 60s and early 1970s. I think students would also be well advised to lean into classes that lie at the intersection of both budgeting, accounting, as well as statistical modeling, and budget planning and budget forecasting, as well as benefit cost analysis, and the all-important public financial accounting and accounting in general, I think, are places where you're going to see much demand for public and private entities looking for people with policy analysis and program evaluation skills, trying to apply some of those skills to the modeling and forecasting of some of our financial challenges that we currently face and that we are going to face in even larger extent in the future. We're starting to see the emergence of a number of budget labs that have sprouted up. There's one at Yale University, and there's one at Wharton. I'm familiar with a number of other universities that are considering standing up other budget labs, and I think that those are places where students that are interested in the policy analysis space will find growing and new opportunities, and the number of private consultancies specializing in forecasting in general, I believe, will likely grow as the financial and economic environment continues to remain unstable and difficult to predict. So I think the good news is that many of the students that are historically, I think, been oriented towards the policy analysis space are finding opportunities this summer. Many of them are finding them outside of the federal government, in local and state government. but they are still there. Now, how long they will remain there is hard to know. And it also, I would say, appears that there are some new emerging opportunities, particularly in the budget planning space around the emergence of new budget labs that are out there. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Doug and let us get to some questions. Oh, you're muted, Doug.
David, so much. Thank you so much. That was great. All four of you, terrific. I've been watching the Q&As, and I'll try to ask those questions in a moment. But first, you all have patiently listened to each other. Does anyone want to add something to what the other panelists have said?
So I think there's been a lot of, I see in the Q&A, lots of concerns and discussion about AI. It's a term that encompasses so much that it's a little bit hard to get a purchase on it. But I think in our field, the question really is whether it's going to be mostly an issue on the intensive margin, in the sense of substituting for the kind of work that people were doing in the past, in the kinds of evaluations that we were doing in the past, or whether it actually offers opportunities for other kinds of analysis, for more kinds of analysis, for increasing the amount of evidence that goes into the policy process. I actually don't know what the answer to that is. It will, I think, depend very much on these issues of governance and demand. If we wind up running a government that doesn't value evidence, I can't see why the AI is just gonna take over whatever little work there is left to be done, and there won't be anything else. If instead we pivot to a government that is more reliant on evidence, I think we may have the opportunity to produce it more effectively than we have in the past.
On that issue for everybody, there is a theme within the Q&A that some of you all of us, including me, are too optimistic. So I suppose the question is not, well, what are the chances of things changing, but how do we ground our reasonable optimism, which is to say this could be the future, but we could revert to something else. We could revert to what it was like in the past or some combination thereof. You all seem somewhat optimistic. Why? Is it just because it's your job to be optimistic?
I'd say I'm optimistic about the capabilities. That doesn't mean there aren't risks, and we'll have to manage those risks. But you take something as simple as a literature survey. That's being done in a fraction of the time, with the assistance of artificial intelligence now by our staff every day. And they're very excited about the ability to do more work that's of interest to them, share it with their colleagues, because they have AI as a more powerful tool in order to support that work. I saw some of the comments in the Q&A, and I think those are all valid concerns about, what happens with labor when we're replacing it with AI, and there will at least be disruption from that. And instead of happening to steel workers somewhere outside Pittsburgh, it's going to happen to our kids when they're coming out of college, because that's a lot of the work that's being filled in by AI now is what recent college grads have often done in the past. So we definitely have to worry about the issues like that, even though, I think at least three of us are economists, so we probably have a fairly optimistic view of the long run about how it works out. But it's definitely disruptive in the short run. And I know there are other issues like in the environment that are brought up in the comments as well. Those are valid issues.
Anyone else?
I was going to say, you go on, Sherry.
I think a little bit of it, the optimism you hear is in the title of the session, which imagines a world after this and says, what might it look like? And I think that is what we're responding to. I don't think any of us are believing that all of that the evaluation infrastructure is going to be rebuilt in the very near future. I don't see that as being in line with the way the administration is moving. But I think we are optimistic that at some point people are going to return to making policy decisions grounded in strong evidence, and that they will want to produce that evidence. And so I think that's where I would think of my optimism.
David?
Yeah, well, I think Sherry hit on an important point, which is I think, there is a drive out there, and I think a sort of curiosity and a desire for good government, I think, by many. So and that's true, I think, among professionals as well as citizens broadly. So I don't see that as going away, and I think that for many of us, and I think others that have spent their professional life in these areas, the way to sort of really get at that in a significant and meaningful way is through the systematic inquiry and these efforts designed to get to some version of what we think is the truth. And I think that isn't going anywhere, and I think it will always be channeled in communities like APPAM and others into the program evaluation and policy analysis space.
Well, this could easily be a webinar only on AI, because reading in the Q&A, that's generated a fair amount of talk. Anyone, but I guess especially David here, but really anyone. I'm sorry, Paul. You made it sound as if you were not having problems with AI hallucinating.
I think that's one of the risks of AI. And, we have to, that's why there has to be human oversight to make sure that's not happening. So, and that's why I say, the degree to which you can delegate decisions to AI will depend on the evolution of the technology and how well we can insure ourselves against that kind of risk.
David, Cece, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to say something, which is that I think that the thing that we don't want to lose sight of is the fact that what we bring to the table as humans is judgment. And right now, AI is it works symbolically. It's just language. It does not understand what it is producing or saying. And therefore, what we have, what a critical part of this and a critical part of evaluation and policy development is bringing that kind of judgment to the table. Obviously, it's a challenge for early career people who have to, pivot. Obviously, just having encyclopedic understanding of facts is not going to be enough anymore. And they have this dual challenge of developing the expertise and the judgment while somebody else is feeding them. But I like to remind folks, like when I was coming up back in the dark ages, my dad was a physicist. When I was in high school, he was so excited. He said, Cecilia, when you graduate from high school, I'm going to get you a slide rule. And by the time I graduated, that had turned into an HP reverse Polish calculator. But I can tell you, so back in the 80s, I haven't done this calculation, but I can almost assure you at Brookings, we have more research assistants per scholar today than we had then. So the challenge here is figuring out how we work with the technology. I can add and subtract a lot faster today than my dad did with his slide rule. But it doesn't mean that we're displaced, but we do have to learn how to work with it.
Well, I was trying to get to you, David. Cece just set it up for you. I guess I would say, talking to, quote, the younger people, they are really worried that whatever tools they get will be obsolete. Forget about what profession they go into. And I can see this feeding both uncertainty about what school they should go to, what courses they should take, and actually a fair amount of depression. I spent all these years studying all this stuff. And there was an article in the paper the other day. Why should I go to college? I read about this AI thing. I'm going to go to the beach. David, what do you hear? Everybody's got students. Sherry, you've got students that you're dealing with right now. What are the students saying to you all?
Well, I think there's enormous demand. I think students recognize this, and there's enormous demand and hunger for incorporating coursework in artificial intelligence, across pretty much every single field. And I think one of the challenges is trying to sort of keep up with that demand, and I think, certain parts of the academy are, I think, more naturally are closer to it. I mean, obviously, if you're in computer science or if you're in computer engineering or in a business school, the courses are already stood up and are there and are pretty well integrated into the curriculum. I think, as you get further away from some of those domains, it's a little less so. I am mindful that, but it's rapidly unfolding. I haven't seen anybody chart, the number of new courses that are being introduced with an AI focus across disciplines. But my sense is that it's moving quickly, probably not fast enough to actually keep up with the changes that are happening in the environment. I am also reminded that, the world of decision science in some ways, which is sort of the policy, one of the sort of central domains of policy analysis, and the world of artificial intelligence were in fact, linked with one another. And I think about somebody like Herb Simon, the political scientist who, won the Nobel Prize in, I believe, economics a number of decades ago. He won it for his work on the intersection between decision science and artificial intelligence. And so, in some ways, the world of decision science and policy analysis and program evaluation are come from the same origins and roots as the world of artificial intelligence. So to me, these are sort of two sides of the same coin. They are a part of the same intellectual sort of lineage and family. And anyway, but I think the students are hungry, and universities are working hard to sort of try and keep up.
Sherry?
So we are definitely trying to think about how our students can and should be using AI in their work. But I'm reminded that I made my kids learn their multiplication tables, even though there are calculators. And I think we have to think in the academy, both for people to be able to evaluate whether something is sensible, they kind of have to know how to do it by hand. I still remember X transpose X, right? Even though.
So that's interesting.
Right. And so we're going to have to think about how we educate our students. And also, it would be stupid for me to be doing regression analyses by hand now, even though it is important for me to know how to do them. And I don't multiply 3-digit numbers by hand anymore, even though I did know how to do it. So there's something about incorporating that ground level knowledge and the learning. And I do worry about the extent to which we will have junior analysts who move up and learn the early skills and move into the newer ones. I suspect we will eventually get to some model where we do that, but it's going to be a little tough to get there. Some things I think are probably gone. I don't think learning how to use statistical programming software is going to be the way to get a job in the future, but maybe.
Yeah. So I need to just tell a small story here at Maryland. The instructors who teach statistics and microanalysis, the argument is, do we teach them the old way so they understand what AI is doing, or do we just skip to AI and teach them how to use AI wisely? And notice I added the word wisely there. So I think some of this stuff is
Right. I mean, we have them do writing in class, and we also encourage them to use AI to improve their writing on assignments. Why not? We want to know that they can write, and we also want them to use whatever tools are available to them. I think learning how to program something is useful. Probably learning 3 or 4 different statistical languages is not useful.
Yeah. If I can, Cece, I'm just reading all these comments and I'm trying to shape them in a general conversation. So to the audience, I apologize that I'm not reading some of the comments. They're terrific. Some of them are long paragraphs, and we will share them with the panel. Well, the panelists can see them, but we'll send it out electronically and so forth. One of the issues about our current political situation, right, is, well, say the Democrats win, and I don't want to put the Democrat hat on you, but it might fit. Some people are thinking, well, Trump and the Republicans have sort of started a process. And if Democrats get back in, they're going to do similar kinds of things which we might either like or not like. Um, where does evaluation and policy research go, assuming that the Democrats come back in power? Have they, decided there's a different way to do this too?
So I'm not I'm not a politician.
Yeah, I know.
I'm an economist, so I would hope, so the comment is like, right now we see political stalemate, we see dysfunction in Congress. And I guess my point is very much rooted where Milton Friedman was, which is right now we just see things that are politically impossible. But it is my belief, and you can call me delusional or not, maybe I'm just overly optimistic, which is why I do what I do. But I believe that people will need to make decisions, and they're going to look somewhere in order to make those decisions and understand that they're just not shooting at darts in a dartboard. And I fundamentally believe that people believe when they're making decisions, you might not agree with what their decisions are, but many, and I'm not going to say all decisions, but many decisions are rooted in some fact base that people believe in. I think part of our challenge right now is, what is a real fact? I mean, how many people were at the parade on Saturday? I don't know how many, how bad are the LA riots? We understand that this is what are trusted facts versus not, which is why I believe that organizations such as APPAM, the Academy, I know at Brookings, we very much try to be in the space of being really trusted. We're just going to give you the facts. But I really do believe our people look someplace to make decisions, and that will be true whether we have stalemate in Congress or not. And I do believe in, I'll just repeat, when the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable, and our federal government is here to stay. It's been bigger, it's been smaller. Right now, they're making it smaller. I think there's going to be a U-turn there as people start to realize, but we miss our Medicaid, we miss FEMA, we miss these services that we actually understood we were getting. And we're going to want that to be as effective and capable and efficient as possible. And we're going to be looking for ways to make those decisions.
So Paul, picking up on that and to ask a question that you certainly don't have to answer. It seems to me the future, post-DOGE future, is a world in which places like Mathematica will take up a much smaller part of the evaluation space. That AI is lowering the barriers to entry so that the kind of capital and staff investment that big firms have becomes less of an advantage. So one possibility, I suppose, to press on you, and you can just say, Doug, so I don't mean to, we're in front of a lot of people here. But it does seem to me that this presages a very different private sector, much more competitive. And to pick up on Cece's comments, it means discerning consumers big time, because we all trusted Brookings, Mathematica, and so forth and so on.
In a way, I think that's right, Doug, and it's already happening. So take something like the Poverty Action Lab. The Poverty Action Lab was able to create a whole set of evaluations that are adding to the evidence base because evaluations were getting cheaper to conduct over time. And that became possible to run an enterprise doing that from a large university. So yeah, Mathematica continued to expand that whole time as well. So, if again, kind of getting back to the themes that Cece was pressing on, what do we expect to happen when evaluation becomes cheaper, easier, faster? We expect much more of it because it has value and the price is going down. So I expect, for all the reasons that CC's described, we'll continue to see a reliance on evidence in the federal government as well as in other public policy spaces. To the extent folks ignore the evidence and make decisions to generate worse outcomes, that can't be a long-run equilibrium. And so I suspect we'll continue to rely on evidence, and that'll continue to expand. And places like Mathematica will continue to have a role in that process. And it may not just be the threat of competition from other research-minded individuals. It might be the Palantirs of the world who say, we don't need all that stuff. We've got the technology, they'll do it in a more automated way. And we don't have any PhDs on staff. There used to be a company like this that specifically had the tagline, no PhD required. Well, that was 20 years ago that they had that tagline. And that hasn't come true yet. And I don't expect it to come true in the immediate term. But there are definitely people looking for ways to rely less on highly paid staff to get the work done, at least in some situations. And that may be the right solution in some situations. So I tend to have a fairly expansive view about the volume of evidence generation that will be taking place. And so I don't worry so much that there'll be others involved and it'll crowd us out.
David, you made when you were talking about thank you, Paul. When you were talking about where the students are going for the internships, and that's our experience as well. I think our audience here might be particularly federal oriented, but it does feel as if the states and localities uh, will pick up the ball here in many ways that um, we haven't seen for decades. What Sherry called real-time performance evaluation.
Well, I think that's right, and it's also consistent with the idea that so much of what happens in the policy space sort of is in the experiments and sort of a lot of the risk taking, historically has been in state governments as sort of laboratories, sort of trying to figure out some of the different levers and approaches. And so I think that that's sort of maybe always been the case, and it might on balance shift more in that direction, as we sort of encounter sort of this pullback from federal support for policy analysis, and perhaps the consumption of policy analysis as being something that actually is going to be used or useful in the federal policymaking process. So in some ways, it's maybe going back to the beginning. Sherry was talking about the sort of the emergence of this field, and so maybe we're sort of in some ways sort of going to find ourselves in some ways sort of getting closer in touch with our roots, which I think came from a variety of state and local governments. And I'm also mindful that the world has changed dramatically during the evolution of this space, over the past 50, 60 years. So the interest in consumption and of governments around the world is, there are a lot more sort of clients for Paul and others that are sort of interested in this kind of work and consuming the results of it. And so I'd imagine that there's also sort of an internationalization component here that is likely to happen and to sort of continue to accelerate.
And there are many different models for how a nation or a community of nations do policy research. The Europeans don't do it our way.
Right.
And they scratch their heads when they see our big RCTs. You spend that much money to answer that question? I said, well, we're a rich country, what can I say? Um,
But
we're getting towards the end, and I want to say two things. First, a number of people in the Q&A have said, hey, can we see these questions? So I don't know the answer to that. I will ask APAM if it's appropriate, and I'll ask the other panelists after we're off the air and all that, whether we can share this somehow. I sure don't have a problem there. Everyone's been quite polite and all that sort of stuff. That's sometimes the problem on these things. But there were a number of comments which it might be appropriate to end on. And that is, we've been very technocratic here. And we know that part of what's happened with the cutbacks has been a pushback against social justice concerns. But maybe we should spend a few minutes just talking about how that fits into the future.
so I think we as evidence builders and evaluators have an important role to play, even if social justice concerns are not in the forefront of what politicians are concerned about. And that actually goes back to some of the comments I was making earlier around the ability to do much more distributional analysis, for example, in our evidence building than we have ever done in the past. And that is something that we ought to be doing as a matter of practice. We should be pointing out who winners and losers are, even if it is not our role to say what they ought to be. I think just in the pursuit of evidence, it's incumbent upon us to show not only whether people win, whether on average people are doing better, but who are the people who are going to lose from this policy. And so I think that is natural for us and actually increasingly possible.
I agree with that. And I think this is something I really pushed for in design of projects, design of evaluations in recent years, because the challenge is you want to put that up front in the design for all the reasons you guys talked about before in terms of power, statistical power, and being able to make the statements that you want to make based on the distribution about who the winners and losers are. So it's important for us as the technocrats, I guess, to think about how we build that into the design and press ourselves on that issue.
I was going to say there's this contest over whether or not as I like Sherry's phrase, evidence builders, whether or not evidence building is sort of a neutral political act or not. I think has always been sort of a front and center, not only for this field but pretty much every part of the social sciences, which sort of are the building blocks of the fields that we're talking about right now. And I think it's always been basically up to the ethics, the ethos of the practitioners to be the ones that actually are the guardians of whether or not they are going to be engaged in a political project, or whether or not they're going to be engaged in sort of an effort that is going to sort of try to remain sort of neutral in terms of the political sort of slanting of things. So I mean, I do think that, and I hope we'll sort of see how the things evolve. We live in such a politicized world that you can pretty much can't say anything without people thinking that it's sort of a political act. So I certainly hope that we can sort of hold true, I think, to some of the, at least the founders of this field, that I think sort of saw it as being sort of a neutral, sort of objective domain, and a place that was not going to become sort of overwhelmed and overly influenced by the political motives. But that's it's tough in this day and age.
Well, let me say, I've tried to be a moderator here, but let me say something on this issue. Coming from a school where we have had a marvelous influx of the next generation of Americans, and they are from every place in the world. And when you ask them where they're from Prince George's County, Montgomery County, Delaware, but they are from their families are from all over the world. And so I think uh, what else that's going to happen in our field and in a lot of fields is this next generation is going to want to think differently about many of the things that we've grown up about and that we take for a given. And so this is a continuing process. I think this has been a terrific conversation, and I thank the panelists. I also thank the audience. There's still a lot of you there, and we will do our darndest, unless someone says we can't do it, to let you see all the comments because they're terrific as well. Anyway, thank you all. And good luck, or whatever he used to say. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Doug.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.